What if the Egypt you are taught was only half the truth? My voice pierces the hush as the camera glides over crumbling temple stones, their hieroglyphs weathered but still whispering secrets. The Nile winds like a silver serpent through the landscape, reflections trembling on its surface. In the distance, ancient walls stand silent, witness to forgotten truths. Soft as a prayer, ancestral voices echo over the river. Listen. Remember. Imagine those voices asking, who were the gods before the pharaohs walked the sands of Giza? What lies at the true source of the Nile, not just a river, but the spiritual spine of a continent? Why did history so often strip Africa's soul from Egypt's story? We drift through misty dawn light, temples half submerged in memory. A distant drumbeat reminds us of lost ceremony, of rhythms older than dynasties. Ruined columns seem to sigh under the weight of untold stories. This is not archaeology alone, it is reclamation. We stand at the threshold between myth and erasure, between the Nile's hidden origin and the narratives that follow. The world learned of pharaohs, pyramids, and monumental achievements, but what of the spirits that shaped them? What of Khnum, the potter god, whose clay hands crafted humanity on Elephantine Island? What of Hapi, the spirit of the flood, whose rhythm determined life and death for wide swaths of Africa? These gods were never foreign to the land. They emerged from its heart. They breathed through the forests of East Africa and pulsed in the veins of its lakes. And yet, their presence has been muted. Visitors told that Egypt began in the Delta, not in the highlands. Scholars claimed its roots lay in the Near East, not within Africa's oldest cultures. Museums stoop under the weight of artifacts whose provenance has been whitewashed. Education teaches in fragments. Still, even here, amid stainless and shrouded statuary, the pulse of older origins beats if we listen. So let me invite you to listen with me. Let us follow the Nile upstream, beyond the pyramids and priests, beyond the textbooks and exhibitions. Let us explore what the textbooks silenced, what the museum walls concealed. We will uncover Egypt's true ancestral map, where African gods walked, spoke, and breathed life into the river's course. We will bridge continent and cipher, clay and covenant. We will remember. Are you ready to see Egypt anew? The journey begins now. The Nile was never just a river. It was the lifeblood of a spiritual civilization, a divine path that connected cultures, gods, and people across inner Africa to the lands of Kemet. Imagine standing where its gentle currents begin, in the misty highlands of Uganda and the crater lakes of the Great Lakes region, where the earliest droplets gather, unaware of their destiny. From here, the Nile begins its journey northward, carrying not only water but the memory of a continent, flowing through Ethiopia's rugged plateaus, threading through the birthplace of ancient African kingdoms, and carrying with it stories older than written history. To the people of Inner Africa, this was not an ordinary waterway. It was called the Vein of the Gods. Every shimmer on its surface hinted at ancestral presence. Every pool held the breath of primordial spirits. As the river wound its way north, it wove a spiritual umbilical cord between the heart of Africa and the glory of Kemet. It carried chants, rhythm, prophecy, and prayer. It offered boundaries of nourishment and identity. Communities springing up along its banks grew not only through agriculture but through a sense of connection to a shared source, ecologically and eternally. It was part highway, part memory, part covenant. When people in the Nile Delta worshipped Khnum at Elephantine Island, they were influenced by flows originating thousands of miles to the south. When they celebrated Hapi's flood on the western floodplains, they honored a legacy carried from the wetlands of Uganda and Ethiopia. These felt nothing like imported beliefs. They felt like ancestral conversation transported by water. The river's source was never a mystery to them. It was a pilgrimage. It was both metaphysical and physical, an invitation to remember origins and honor continuity. But colonial narratives have told us a different story. Standard textbooks claim the Nile story begins by the pyramids, with Joseph and Pharaoh, with dynastic Egypt, a relatively narrow tale. Yet this approach erases what the people who revered the river would have always known, that the lake-sourced springs of Inner Africa gave the Nile its divinity. Without those fountains, the river would run dry. Without that connection, the spiritual current would be broken. To reclaim true understanding, we must reinstate the river's origin. As the Nile flows north, so did ideas of kingship, of cosmic balance, of agricultural renewal. Astronomical knowledge traveled on its shoulders. The river shaped calendars, mythologies, and the cycle of death and rebirth that lay at the heart of African spiritual systems. When these reached Kemet, they took on new form but carried the DNA of their ancestors, recognizable in festival dates, in rites of fertility, in the rhythm of flood and sowing. We revisit the Nile source. We step into the midst of Ugandan highlands. We listen to the echoing calls of birds at Ethiopia's plateaus. We feel the movement of water gathering its force, collecting voices of tribes, of spirits, of cosmic order. We sense that the river is a messenger across time and space, carrying not just moisture, but memory. And as it flows into Kemet, we begin to understand why Egypt's power was rooted not in separation but in connection, connection to all of Africa, in a spiritual and geographical lineage that cannot be erased by stones or textbooks. Thus the Nile emerges not merely as a geographic feature but as a sacred conduit, the vein of gods, the umbilical of civilizations. Its origin is not just an interest for geographers, it is a revelation for the soul. Ethiopia, long before the rise of dynastic Egypt, served as a cradle for Nile Valley spirituality, a cultural springhead deep within Africa's vast terrain. Known to its people as Taseti, the land of the bow, it was home to early hunter-warrior societies whose spiritual cosmology centered on the river and its divine purpose. These communities understood the Nile not merely as a life-giving artery, but as a sacred conduit connecting earth and spirit. From the Ethiopian highlands to the Nubian borderlands, ancestral memories carried the understanding that when the river flowed, cosmic balance was at work. This land of the bow was not simply a geographic location, it was a spiritual anchor where the sourcing of life and divine narrative took place long before pharaonic dynasties began to etch their legacy into stone. Leading us forward in this lineage is Khnum, the potter god of Elephantine Island, who fashioned humankind from Nile clay on his wheel. Far from being a creation myth of isolated origin, Khnum's presence speaks to a continuity between Upper Nile traditions and emerging Kemetite theology. Elephantine itself held dual identity, not just as a frontier of trade and culture, but as a neutral ground between Nubian and Egyptian spiritual domains. Khnum sat at the source, literally and metaphorically, shaping clay and consciousness, embodying humanity's origin from the Nile's mud. It is a spiritual lineage that echoes all the way back to the clay pools beneath Ethiopian peaks and Uganda's crater lakes, binding the watery origins of humanity to the art of divine creation. Descended from this creative principle is Hapi, the spirit of Nubian and Egyptian floodwaters, son of Nile rumbling. But Hapi is more than an Egyptian deity. He's part of a broader fertility paradigm found across Black Africa. He carries the essence of water's promise, of life renewed with every inundation. In Ethiopia and along the Great Lakes, ancestral spirits associated with inundation ceremonies celebrated the receding waters. Myth and ritual merged to give ripple-like prophecy. From serpentine floods came crops. Communities resurrected each year. Happy, honored with unclothed breasts. A potbelly symbolizing abundance. Shared continuity with Western African mother fertility spirits, all tied to the pulses of water cycles that began far upstream. Then came the family of cosmic archetypes elevated by Kemet, Ra, Ausar, Aset, Heru, who, though widely considered uniquely Egyptian, carry echoes of African cosmology. Ra's solar sovereignty is predated by African sun-centered worship across Saharan and sub-Saharan communities. Ausar's death and rebirth cycle evokes parallels across African spiritual symbolism of ancestral transformation. Aset, the divine mother and healer, finds counterparts in West African mother ancestors. Heru's sky warrior identity maps onto myriad thunder and sky deities across the continent, from East Africa's storm liaisons to West Africa's eagle hunters. These divine figures are not insular inventions, but evolving archetypes refined as Nile Valley theology solidified. In this emergent pantheon, Nubian priests and oral traditions played a critical role. Before any pyramid rose, Nubian clans transmitted stories of Khnum, Hapi, and sky deities through songs, storytelling, and ritual drumming. Even today, echoes of those traditions persist. Among the Dinka of Sudan and the Oromo of Ethiopia, chants describing rains, spirits, and celestial events draw lines of continuity. In the Great Lakes region, great mother figures and ancestral spirits bear uncanny resemblance to Aset's nurturing powers. And across Eastern Africa, ceremonial chants invoke Noami names resembling Ausar's cosmic order, indicating a shared spirituality that spans ecologies and elevations. These oral traditions were not peripheral, they were foundational. They informed early Nile Valley languages, cardinal directions, and agricultural rites. Each harvest festival, each Nile inundation ceremony, each temple building act was built upon a foundational lodestar, the river's source in Africa's interior. When early Kemetite rulers inscribed creation myths in hieroglyph, they were encoding not only local belief, but the resonant memory of Ethiopia's Ta Seti, Uganda's crater myths, and the ancestral footprints of water priestesses from centuries before. In contemporary times, when researchers study sub-Saharan language families, they find shared roots for words like water, mother spirit, and sky. It reinforces a singular current of divine symbolism that flows from the continent's headwater regions into the Nile Delta. It affirms that Khnum, Hapi, Ra, Ausar, Aset, and Heru did not spring up in isolation. They are the summation of Africa's spiritual poles, carried by currents of water and word, birthed in the hills of Taseti, refined along the Nile, and made eternal in stone. Priests, pilgrims, and seekers traveled along the Nile long before the bricks of the pyramids were set in place. The spiritual migration of wisdom began deep in Central and East Africa, threaded through complex networks of riverine trade and pilgrimage, and culminating in the Delta, where it splintered into stone, ritual, and ceremony. It is easy to assume that civilization's gifts flowed from the north down, but the truth is that many ideas, sacred geometry, astronomical knowledge, divine kinship, flowed upward, carried by voices, vision, and covenant along the river's current. The Nile was not just Egypt's river, it was a cosmic highway along which memory and power traveled between highlands and desert, hill and delta ancestors and kings. Long before pharaohs employed scribes, priests from what is now Ethiopia and Nubia held that role. They were the ancestral chroniclers, ritual architects, mouthpieces of spirit. In temple precincts across the Nile's upper reaches, they inscribed glyph-like symbols on soft stone, carved cosmological registers into rock faces, and spoke incantations that imbued space with spiritual architecture. These were not outsiders, they were originators. They charted the stars, aligned stones with celestial axes, and brought the language of the skies into temples far downstream. Their influence is visible, not just in the orientation of pyramids, but in the mathematics of their angles, the echo chambers created within inner sanctums, and the celestial alignment of their peaks. Such precision was less geometry than prayer, a sacred geometry born of ancestral knowledge. Nubian builders, whose monumental masonry in the Kerma and Kushite traditions predates Kemetite structures, brought techniques northward, pathways of stone, causeways of ritual, tomb construction that echoed clan burial chambers of the south. In these corridors lay the spiritual pulse of lineage. Elite families in the Delta petitioned Nubian scribes to articulate king-based cosmologies that would frame divine kingship, suggesting a mutual respect across regional traditions. The notion that pharaohs were gods incarnate was not conceived in a vacuum. It was refined through shared hermeneutics, ritual laws, and ceremonial pacts originating far upstream. Astronomy too followed this flow of knowledge. The Dogon people of Mali, though much farther west, share star-based ritual models with ancient Kemet. Their knowledge of Sirius, of its companion stars, predates telescopic science. The sacred alignment of Kemet's sky temples, facing Sirius' heliacal rising, is mirrored in Dogon astrological ritual alignments, suggesting a shared tradition or cosmic language. Ideas of cosmic matriculation, of the body as microcosm, of kings as cosmic dancers are not accidental. The echo patterns remembered across Africa, carried and refined along spiritual currents, carried aboard pilgrim chants, and scribed under starry skies. Divine kingship itself is not a pharaoh's invention, but a spiritual inheritance. The concept of a ruler as intermediary between humanity and spirit realms was already present in Ethiopian monarchies, Nubian priesthoods, and Central African matrilineal societies. When this idea reached the Delta, it found fertile ground in temple building efforts, solar theology, and ancestor worship. What emerged was a political theology shaped by flowing interaction, not by conquest but by shared ritual language. The pharaoh's crown once contained feathers of Maat, not because it was an invented symbol, but because it was the heirloom of spiritual ancestors who wielded the stern but compassionate voice of cosmic equilibrium. But this flow of wisdom northward would later be hidden, reinterpreted, and repackaged. Colonial archaeologists preferred the drama of dynastic solo acts. They turned priests into scribes, scribes into vegetables, and severed the river's spiritual lineage into imposed zones. Yet signs endure. Temple walls in Elephantine, in Aswan, in Luxor bear mirrored inscriptions in archaic forms. Excavations in Kama reveal ceremonial architecture, pottery inscriptions that echo Delta glyph practice, and Syriac prayers that roam from south to north. The pyramids themselves align not only to stars but to ancestral mountain peaks, remnants of rituals once performed upstream. The spiritual migration continued in hidden form. It traveled through wandering priests and secret cults to remote Ethiopian monasteries, to Nubian tombs concealed beneath desert sands, to masked ceremonies in remote villages. As written, hieroglyph faded, ritual survived. Travelers relate seeing Delta priests crossing into Kush to renew pacts. Clan genealogies still recite names tracing back to Kushite hierophants. That is to say, the Nile's knowledge never stopped flowing, it simply changed channels. In essence, we discover that the wisdom of pyramids, temples, and divinity is not Egypt's alone. It is shared inheritance, a product of millennia of cross-river communion. The river creator is not a line but a network, a watershed of spiritual intelligence carried on human vessels, guided by ancestors, shaped by prayer, and enshrined in stone. The lost link reveals that Africa's first script, first stars, and first temple doctrine were not isolated artifacts. They were nodes in a living tradition mapped onto the Nile corridor. For every monument built at Giza, there was an ancestor from upriver whose hand shaped its soul. For every stately solar alignment, there was a memory, coming from inner Africa, of reading the sky as prayer. We are uncovering a river-sized lineage that demands we see beyond borders. Understanding this upstream lineage repositions Egypt not as a detached fallen empire but as a living spiritual echo chamber for Africa's ancestral waters. It invites us to hold the Nile not as a boundary but as a circuit, a conduit of divine knowledge flowing upstream and downstream, connecting all who have listened to the source. Colonial adventurers and early Egyptologists reshaped the story of ancient Egypt not through fact but through narrative erasure. Their expeditions were not neutral explorations, they were reinterpretations that stripped the Nile's gods of their African identity. Scholars rebranded Khnum, Hapi, Ausar, and Aset as extensions of Middle Eastern pantheons, not as expressions of deeper African cosmology. As a result, Egypt was recast as an Eastern empire transplanted into Africa, erasing its origins in the rivers and hills of the continent. This myth endures. Too often, schoolbooks teach that Egyptian civilization was an external import, complete with foreign rulers and borrowed gods, erasing thousands of years of indigenous African spiritual development. The consequences of this false story are visible in museums around the globe. Artifacts reportedly discovered in Nubia, Sudan, and Upper Egypt are regularly misattributed or whitened to fit colonial perspectives. Visitors will see black granite statues lightened for aesthetics, labels emptied of African context, and pharaonic images stripped of their powerful African symbolism. Across Europe and North America, exhibitions describe ancient gods as Mediterranean deities without context of Tuareg, Oromo, or Nubian traditions. Collections are often untraceable. Looted pieces are hidden behind generic narratives. These artifacts are preserved, but their root meanings are severed. Religion also played a strategic role in silencing Nile-based spirituality. When Christianity spread across North Africa in late antiquity and Islam in the Middle Ages, they walked the corridors of temples once dedicated to ancestral gods. The narrative shifted. Village spirits became demons to exorcise. Sacred river sites became places of sin, and oral traditions were recast as pagan vestiges. Monasteries and mosques replaced temples, forbidding the old rites, while colonial authorities backed the erasure with policy and land confiscation. Early missionaries proudly proclaimed they were saving souls by extinguishing idol worship, never realizing that indigenous Nile spirituality spoke of relationships, not idols. Today, modern education often continues what colonial powers began. History textbooks from Africa to the West tend to separate Egypt from a larger African context, presenting it as an anomaly. Students learn of Greek and Roman influences, but seldom of Nubian, Ethiopian, or Sudanese connections. The gods of Egypt are characterized as unique exceptions, not part of a continuum that stretches from inner Africa to the Mediterranean. Children learn about pyramids without understanding their links to Ethiopian highlands or Kenyan plateaus. They study pharaohs without learning that priests and kings of Kush ruled earlier than Menes. This fractured education perpetuates division, encouraging young Africans to see Egypt as foreign rather than foundational, or worse, to believe that greatness only comes through assimilation into non-African frameworks. Meanwhile, these modes of erasure do not simply disappear. They operate in tandem with economic and political agendas. Tour routes circle Giza. Textbooks mention Sumer and Babylon, but seldom Tasseti or Nubia. Scholars may publish academic articles, but these rarely reach the communities whose legacies they discuss. Meanwhile, descendants of Nubian villages displaced by the High Aswan Dam still lack the resources to preserve their heritage. Without support, their rituals, chants, and stories risk extinction as museums sell artifacts and narratives sell identity. Yet despite this systemic suppression, the spiritual memory of Nile-based African identity endures in surprising places. Underground churches in Nubia sometimes maintain quiet offerings to Hapi during the flood. Rural schools in Uganda occasionally sing in Oron languages with lines reminiscent of pharaonic chants. The whisper of suppressed memory rides on the smoke of incense in remote caves. Modern spiritual seekers and scholars are beginning to unearth this dampened archive, refusing to accept textbook brevity. Across digital platforms, movements arise, focused on reconnecting Ethiopia, Nigeria, Ghana, and South Sudan to Nile-based identity, demanding that the story be told again in full. The systematic erasure of Egypt's African dimensions is not an accidental historical footnote. It is an ideological infrastructure built to sustain narratives of superiority and separation. By casting Egypt as a Middle Eastern anomaly, colonial and post-colonial powers achieved two objectives. They validated their own claims to authority and the fractured African historical and spiritual unity. But when we challenge that erasure, we begin to rebuild the river's true course. To restore these lost roots, we must support artifact restitution, revise education, and elevate the oral histories of African communities. We must challenge museum narratives that whiten the divine, and reimagine school curricula to include Nubian and Ethiopian contributions. We must reclaim ancestral spiritual practices once declared pagan. We must listen to ceremony, chant, and oral tradition carried down from the original priests, those who held the river's memory before walls were built. In doing so, we are not merely rewriting history, we are reactivating a spiritual lineage that courses through every drop of the Nile. We are undoing the violence of mislabeling, museum theft, and narrative erasure, and we are returning power over identity to the very people whose ancestors first claimed it, not as foreigners, but as the life givers of a civilization that thrived through African genius and African cosmology. This erasure has persisted for centuries, but it is not permanent. As each child, community, and scholar reclaims the gods of Egypt, we rebuild both river and memory together as inheritors of the Nile's ancient covenant. African spiritualists are currently leading a sweeping renaissance, reclaiming ancient deities such as Ausar, Ma'at, Aset, and Heru, not as distant gods of a vanished era, but as living spirits whose presence still flows within communities across Africa. In urban centers from Accra to Addis Ababa, ceremonial altars once silent now pulse with lit chants and offerings. Practitioners wrap rosemary, frankincense, and palm leaves around statues of Ausar and Aset, channeling ancestral energies through ritual words passed down orally. Ma'at's feather, once relegated to dusty museum shelves, is again revered as a cosmic balancing instrument in initiation rites where participants stand before the rising sun to restore spiritual equilibrium. Heru's warrior energy, once obscured by colonial misrepresentation, is now being invoked to empower individuals resisting spiritual and political oppression. These African spiritualists assert a direct lineage to the Nile's divine past, reinforcing that these deities never left. They were suppressed, but their worship persisted below the surface. Simultaneously, Black consciousness movements across the continent and in the diaspora are linking spiritual revival to cultural and political renewal. In Ethiopia, youths gather in university temples to study both Ma'at ethics and Pan-Africanist ideals. In Kampala, community leaders organize Nile commemoration festivals that feature ritual dances reenacting the flood cycles once dedicated to Hapi and Aset, illustrating how Nile spirituality shapes societal values. In Kinshasa, Congo, drumming circles reintroduce rhythmic patterns believed to synchronize hearts to the heartbeat of Heru, while story circles recount the tales of Taseti ancestors who built the earliest shrines. These movements understand the gods of Egypt not as museum artifacts but as ancestral teachers whose wisdom can aid today's struggles against disconnection and inequality. Part of this awakening involves reconnecting regions across East and Central Africa to their Nile heritage. In Uganda, sacred water sites are being rediscovered. Springs once forgotten are again honored with offerings of kola, millet beer, and sacred chants resonating from Ghanaian, Yoruba, and Igbo traditions. Ethiopians celebrate the annual flood rites along the Kibi River, echoing the pharaonic flood festivals, as priests in traditional robes call the cycle a return to Ma'at. In both South Sudan and Northern Congo, where colonial violence disrupted lineage, elders are recovering family stories of river spirits and mythical flood heroes. Some even are naming newborns Ausar or Aset to honor the revival of memory. Central to this resurgence are initiation ceremonies revived from oral tradition. In Ghana, initiates endure nights of silence by riverbanks, echoing Hapi's presence in the waters, feeding ancestral echoes in their veins. Zimbabwean spirit mediums undergo trance rites in caves beneath baobab trees, reciting structured invocations that align with Nile cosmology, though they never traveled to Egypt. In Cameroon, women host sunrise gatherings beneath fig trees, calling forth Aset's healing energies for newborns and mothers, a practice directly echoing ancient temple rituals in Kemet. Where specialists were lost, contemporary priests and priestesses are said to receive dreams, teaching them chants once buried. These rites are not reconstruction, they are resurgence. Songs and drumming also carry forward this sacred memory. in Dakar, Senegal, percussion ensembles have released albums titled Return to Kemet, where songs echo Ma'at's balance and Heru's razor focus. In Nairobi, an interfaith choir of African spiritualists holds public performances under the full moon, where congregants sing Aset's praises in languages from Amharic to Luganda. These performances, shared via live stream across diaspora networks, channel Nile energies globally, redefining what it means to worship these gods in modern life. Digital platforms are amplifying the mission. Facebook groups share ritual script for Ausar's Day of Resurrection. Twitter threads connect diaspora seekers to elders in Hara practicing flood circle ceremonies, and YouTube channels collect footage of stone carving chants reconstructed by Ghanaian artists. Scholars in Cape Town are collaborating with Ethiopian monasteries to document their flood time ritual continuum through oral interviews, with the intention of republishing accessible books that challenge colonial archives. This is not nostalgia, it is resurgence, combining tradition with modern technology. In academic arenas, courses are emerging at universities in Lagos and Kampala that study Nile-based spiritual systems not as mythology but as philosophical frameworks. Scholars contextualize Me'it's justice principle within equitable governance, link Ausar's regeneration cycle to ecological restoration, and explore Heru's warrior archetype through peacekeeping movements in conflict zones. These curricula are empowering young Africans, providing spiritual context to their struggles, rooted in ancestral but living values. Crucially, these spiritual movements operate with humility. They open temples to the public, invite intercultural dialogue, and collaborate with Christian and Muslim leaders, demonstrating that Aset's compassion and Ma'at's balance transcend religious lines. In southern Sudan, revivalists rebuilt a shrine near the Nile where graduates of Islamic schools now honor Hapi before leading prayers, spiritual syncretism rooted in respect, not appropriation. This broad yet interconnected resurgence testifies that the gods of Egypt are not relics. They are spiritual ancestors still walking with us. Their return is not an act of appropriation, it is remembrance. When people across Ethiopia, Uganda, Congo, South Sudan, Ghana, Nigeria, and beyond invoke Ausar, Ma'at, Aset, or Heru, when they gather by river or cave, sunrise or full moon, they are calling spirits that never left. They are renewing the covenant between Nile, humanity, and spirit systems, restoring sacred equilibrium to a world out of balance. This is more than ritual revival. It is spiritual revolution. Each chant, each drumbeat, each initiation reactivates a fragment of cosmic memory. When rivers flood in ritual, mountains tremble with ancestral praise, and Nile memory is rekindled across continents. The African gods are indeed returning, not in myth but in living practice. Their emergence signals a reconnection to the river's eternal source, an affirmation that Africa's spiritual currents still run, still guide, still shape destiny. If this resurgence feels personal, it is meant to be. These movements are not just historical, they are lived. They invite you to stand by the river, to chant, to remember, to honor. The gods wait, the Nile listens, the source awakens. They never told you because you were the key. That truth pulsed in your veins all along. The Nile's true origin flows within you, embedded in your lineage and your stories. For centuries, narratives vanished, diminished, and were rewritten, but the spirit of the river persisted, waiting for you to remember. They feared that if you reclaimed the source, you would awaken not just knowledge, but power. They feared you would become what the Nile always intended you to be, a living altar of ancestral and spiritual connection. African spirituality was never primitive. It was and remains cosmic, eternal, and profoundly sophisticated. It was designed to stretch across the sky and through the soul, to codify the cycles of the sun, the patterns of the stars, the rise and fall of rivers, and the heartbeat of all living beings. When you stand by that river, you face not only geography, but genealogy, a tapestry woven from clay, water, fire, and breath. You are not just from Africa, you are from the gods who shaped the Nile, Khnum, who molded you with clay, Ma'at, who taught balance, Aset, who healed, Heru who protected. Their legacy is not entombed in antiquity, it lives in you. So hear this now as if it were a drumbeat in your chest. You are the Nile, you are the myth, you are the forgotten chapter of an unbroken story. This is your calling, your inheritance, and your responsibility. May Ausar's renewal awaken your spirit. May Mount's justice guide your steps. May Aset's compassion fill your heart, and Heru's courage light your path. I pray that the river of this truth nourishes you, that the cosmic blueprint of our ancestors courses through your bones, empowering you to rise, reconnect, and remember. If this journey resonates with you, if your soul feels the tug of the river's source, leave a comment below with these words: I am a child of the Nile. Join this circle of remembrance, and subscribe for more forgotten African truths. Let us continue to cross thresholds together. Next, we will explore the gods that crossed the ocean, African spirits in the Americas, tracing the ancestral footprints that became our diaspora lifelines. Until then, may the Nile's current carry you home.